Hello and welcome, and thank you for coming. This home that you're in is the Fraser Mansion. Was built by George Fraser, back in 1890. And it was built as a single-family home. It's a very historic home here. It's on the National Register of Historic Places, and as a kind of an anchor here in the DuPont Circle area of Washington, D.C. And we are very fortunate to have this building now as our public affairs office, so we hold all kinds of events similar to this one here, where we actually allow different groups to come and use this beautiful facility in order to talk about important issues that we want to take on and that we want to do more about, because it's important to the Church of Scientology that we have a peaceful world, that we have our human rights, and that we have people able to speak out and to be able to say what they have to say about conditions in the world and to be able to have a voice. So we really appreciate that you're here tonight, and I think you'll be hearing some very interesting information about a human rights program that we sponsor, which is called Youth for Human Rights and also United for Human Rights. They're sister programs. One is for the youth and teaches about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the United for Human Rights is also about the Universal Declaration, but works with people to come together to help create human rights. I was on the board of directors of this organization for 5 years and helped develop our website program and getting the information out all around the world. And you're going to hear a lot more about that from our director here in our Washington office. So I would like to just welcome you again, and I'd like to introduce our moderator. Here you are.
Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Dvorak-Little, and warm welcome to all of you who came out here in the rain to hear about human rights and human rights violations. This evening we have 4 illustrious speakers, and I'm going to briefly introduce them and then offer a more articulated short bio as each one is introduced. But we have 4 speakers this evening. We have, and I hope that I don't make fouls on the names. We have Isabel Vladoiu, who is the director of the United for Human Rights, Washington D.C. chapter. And to her right, we have Greg Scarlatoiu, who is the executive director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea in Washington, D.C. And to his right, we have Nicole Margaret, who represents the Uyghur Human Rights Project. And to the far right, we have Mr. Mansour El-Hajj, who is a native of Saudi Arabia and is on the board of directors for the Center of Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia. Thank you, all of you, for coming here to speak to us this evening. And we will start with Ms. Vladoiu. Am I saying that correctly? Vladoiu. Thank you.
Okay, good. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. And I'm really looking forward. I had a chance to talk a bit before we started with our panelists tonight, and I think you really enjoyed the talks tonight. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Isabel Vladoiu. I am the director of United for Human Rights in Washington, D.C. chapter, and I have a very huge passion for human rights. Besides my passion for human rights, I pursued a career in finding more about human rights. So I've studied them a lot. I have 2 master's degrees in human rights law, one in Europe, one in the United States, because I was very, very curious about finding out what are the different systems that we have for human rights, how are the different countries seeing human rights, and what are the laws that they put in place to protect such human rights. But I want to open this evening discussion and presentation with our panelists with a topic very, very dear to me, and that is the importance of human rights education. And the way I see it is that there is an intrinsic link between education and human rights. First, because education is actually a basic human rights. That's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights saying it. The second is education can be about human rights. And here we are talking about the implementation of human rights, the international documents that proclaim human rights, and this is what we have at the core of our program, the United for Human Rights International. We have the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this important document, what it does, it proclaims 30 rights, 30 basic human rights that states came together and agreed upon and decided that they must be universal. And the way I say it is that human rights are the basis of everything we most cherish in life, and that comes from everything, every sort of life. That comes from freedom, comes from opportunity, comes from personal security and choice and hope for a better future. And what human rights are basically based on the principle of respect for the individual. That's what human rights teaches you. It teaches you that not only you have a right, but also that other people have rights too. And I've been taught in school also that your right ends where the rights of others people begin. But how you make that transition? So you need to understand that you have rights, but you also have a correlative duty to protect other people's rights. And what are the systems in place to actually protect those rights? And this is where I think that human rights education comes in, basically, because this is how we do it, through human rights education. After I studied so much about human rights abuses, I decided that I'm starting talking with people on the streets about human rights, but do they really know about human rights? Do they really know what human rights are? And that's why I transitioned and I shift the paradigm in my career to going into human rights education. So I know that you may have heard the phrase stand up for human rights or stand up for your rights. Well, how can you stand up for rights if you don't know what your rights are? If you have governments that oppress you and don't let you have human rights. And here I'm not talking only about poor developed countries. I'm talking about every country. I'm talking including about the United States of America, where we don't have the Universal Declaration as a law implemented. We do have constitutional rights, that's right, but what would you prefer, like having 17 rights or having 30 rights, as in the Universal Declaration? I know for sure I would prefer having more. So that's what we do at the United for Human Rights. We provide the tools with this education packages that we have. So we have this component which is for a more advanced audience, for professionals who are working in the human rights field to aid them in teaching human rights to others. And also we have this youth component, which is Youth for Human Rights International, that we teach it in schools, we give it to educators, and we provide them the platform and the materials and the tools so that they can use it. And Youth for Human Rights International actually grew in a international movement. We have chapters and clubs in over 119 countries. So without further ado, what I would like to do, besides me speaking so much about the organization, I want you to be able to see what we do throughout the world and see if our program, which we give these materials are free for everyone, how you can use them in your organizations and in your work and in the field of human rights.
In a world where men, women, and children are denied their dignity and refused their fundamental freedoms, how can human rights be guaranteed? Working to restore personal liberty for all is the Church of Scientology, tirelessly advancing equal rights for all humankind. The creed of the Church includes equal and absolute rights for all mankind. For more than 5 decades, Scientologists have worked to overcome any and all obstacles to champion those inalienable rights. In the 1950s, legislation was being forced through the United States Congress to establish a remote psychiatric asylum in the Alaskan wilderness, where anyone could be involuntarily committed, deprived of their human and civil rights. Scientologists sounded the alarm, and with the information made broadly known, public outcry resulted in the resounding defeat of the Siberia USA bill, thus protecting the rights of every American citizen. Fighting for the rights of all continues to be the hallmark of the Church, and so today it sponsors United for Human Rights. It is an international nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and bringing about broad-scale awareness of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This historic document, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, sets forth the standard of universal freedoms to which every individual on earth is entitled. To that end, United for Human Rights assists and unites individuals, organizations, and governmental bodies in adoption of the UN Declaration at local, national, and international levels. It all begins at a grassroots level with petition drives and distribution of informational booklets to raise public awareness. United for Human Rights volunteers conduct petition drives across the United States, from Los Angeles to the Las Vegas Strip, and from Austin, Texas to New York City. In Canada, in Montreal and Toronto, and to the south in Mexico City's Zocalo Square. In Europe, they work from Paris to Budapest, Rome, and London, more than 100 cities worldwide. Tally it all, and they've gathered more than 500,000 signatures across more than 170 nations, calling for mandatory human rights education for all. Then, United for Human Rights ensures those voices are heard. Case in point, at the UN's Human Rights Headquarters in Geneva, the voices of tomorrow's leaders are given a forum at the International Youth for Human Rights Summit. Young delegates from 40 nations speak out for human rights and set the pace by signing the Global Petition for Human Rights Education, encouraging officials from 50 nations to join in. And so it ripples outward into such lands as Bangladesh. Here, a national chapter of Youth for Human Rights takes on human exploitation in a country known for its sweatshops. It presented young factory workers with petitions bearing the slogan, "Empowering citizens will finally empower the nation." Whereupon a National Human Rights Commission of Bangladesh partnered with Youth for Human Rights to protect the welfare of human beings. In Denmark, the Youth for Human Rights branch takes on rampant discrimination against foreign communities, comprising 10% of the population. Linking with every like-minded humanitarian organization, plus every minority organization, Youth for Human Rights became an official voice of the Danish Human Rights Council. Then there is Guatemala, where the United for Human Rights curriculum rolled out to some 22,000 Guatemalan soldiers. From the National Naval Academy to the Security Army Brigade and the Ministry of Defense and Guatemalan Army Command. All culminating in a permanent partnership to implement United for Human Rights on behalf of more than 1.5 million people. To further expand human rights awareness, Youth for Human Rights produced public service announcements illustrating all 30 articles of the Universal Declaration and expressly created to fuel popular involvement. The PSAs have now played in every conceivable public venue, on Argentinian trains, at Cape Town International Airport, an Athens soccer coach convention, St. Petersburg shopping malls, Budapest cinemas, Lausanne metros, and a Tokyo train station. Not to mention television airplay with Youth for Human Rights public service announcements seen on TV stations in over 120 countries. Then there is the educational The Story of Human Rights. It's designed to open the door to human rights education on all fronts and align all groups worldwide. The film is the centerpiece of both the United for Human Rights and Youth for Human Rights educational programs. Bringing human rights to life a post-secondary education curriculum. Further includes an educator's guide with fact sheets on human rights abuse zones, model petitions, and advocacy guidelines detailing exactly how to make one's voice heard. There is also an education package designed specifically for grade schools and middle schools as part of the Youth for Human Rights program. It similarly provides an educator's guide with lesson plans for younger students, as well as all 30 PSAs and educational booklets. While to educate the rest of the world, there is the interactive online Human Rights Center, humanrights.com. Here, visitors can watch all the PSAs and film, order educational materials, sign the Human Rights Petition, and connect up with advocacy and human rights resources. And all of it to unify people worldwide for Universal Declaration enforcement. Combine it all, and hundreds of organizations and governments have joined forces with United for Human Rights, helping inform tens of millions of their human rights. Nothing is more precious than the inalienable rights of man. You can defend and insist on human rights in your area. Implement human rights education. Hold a petition drive. Join a human rights organization or start a group dedicated to the cause. United, we are a powerful voice for freedom, making human rights an everyday reality for all humankind.
Thank you so much. I think this is very useful, and that's why we do this program, to aid those professionals in the field of human rights and those educators who do not have the materials necessary to actually help. And all our materials are free. We have the interactive component with the videos, and also we have the curriculum for educators as well. So feel free after the session to ask me about them, and I'll be happy to provide you with more information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And up next, we have Mr. Greg Scaletouye. Can you repeat your name for me, please? You got it. I got it? Okay. Mr. Greg Scaletouye is the Executive Director of the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, HRNK, in Washington, D.C. He is a visiting professor at the Hongkou University of the Foreign Studies in Seoul. Mr. Scaletouye is the vice president of the executive board of the International Council of Korean Studies. Prior to HRNK, Mr. Scaletouye was with the Korean Economic Institute, KEI, in Washington, D.C. He has over 6 years of experience in international development projects, holds a master's in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School, Tufts University, and a master's of art and bachelor's of art from Seoul National University's Department of International Relations. He is fluent in Korean and Romanian and was awarded the title Citizen of Honor for the city of Seoul in January 1999. Thank you, Mr. Scaletouye.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction. I'd like to begin by thanking Conflict Solutions International for organizing this event and the Church of Scientology for hosting us tonight. One question that I often hear is, how did you get involved with North Korean human rights? Well, I was actually born and raised in the one Eastern European country that was most similar to Kim Il-sung's North Korea. As some of you recall, Ceausescu, the Romanian dictator, and Kim Il-sung used to be very good friends. After his first visit to North Korea in '71, he wanted to transform Romania into the North Korea of Eastern Europe. Well, it so happened that after the fall of communism, I had never been outside the country. I took several exams for scholarships overseas, wrote an essay about the Han River miracle, the astounding economic development in South Korea, and I was offered a scholarship by the South Korean government to basically go to South Korea and study there. So there is my motivation. I was born and raised in the one Eastern European country that was most similar to Kim Il-sung's Korea, and I spent 10 years, 1 decade, on a divided Korean peninsula while studying, working, living in South Korea. We all know that South Korea has experienced, like many other countries in the region, tremendous economic, social, political development. This is a true democracy and an economic powerhouse, the world's 12th largest economy. In contrast, North Korea, the DPRK, has remained a black hole on the map of Northeast Asia. How did we get here? As you recall, after the United States defeated the Empire of Japan, 15th of August 1945, Korea became independent. Northern half of the peninsula came under Soviet occupation. The southern half of the peninsula came under US control. This developed into political separation. On the 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea, the ROK, South Korea, was established. September the 9th, 1948, the same year, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, was established. Well, June the 25th, 1950, Kim Il-sung launches a surprise attack against South Korea, North Korean invasion. With a UN mandate, UN troops intervene, an armistice halts hostilities pretty much along the same demarcation line on the 27th of July, 1953. How did we get here? Almost 30 years after the end of the Cold War, after the demise of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, not only has the Kim regime managed to survive, it has managed to accomplish 2 hereditary transmissions of power in the process, from grandfather Kim Il-sung to son Kim Jong-il in July 1994, to grandson Kim Jong-un in December 2011. Well, this regime is guided by a set of very clear strategic objectives. Number 1, survival. Number 2, as preposterous as that might sound, this regime has no internal competition, just one competitor, free, democratic, prosperous South Korea. And as preposterous as that might sound, the second strategic objective is the reunification of the Korean peninsula under the Kim family regime as the ultimate guarantee of long-term survival. Third, the development of a nuclear-tipped 3-stage ballistic missile capable of reaching the continental United States as a means to executing the first 2 strategic objectives and as a way, in the regime's view, of retaining international relevance. I don't know when you last heard about Madagascar in the news. Wonderful movie, watched it with my daughters when they were little. The size of North Korea's economy is about the size of Madagascar, so you don't really hear about Madagascar. You hear a lot about North Korea for the wrong reasons: nukes, missiles, and human rights violations. This regime basically obtains the hard currency it needs to keep itself in power by developing nukes, missiles, and keeping its elites happy by oppressing and exploiting its own people at home and abroad. My good friend here, Isabel, mentioned the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights on the 10th of December of this year. We celebrate 7 years since the drafting of the Universal Declaration. As a member of the United Nations, the DPRK is a party to the Universal Declaration. The DPRK is a party to the 2 covenants: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Women's Convention, the Children's Convention. And yet, each and every conceivable human right is violated in North Korea. This is a regime that continues to run a vast system of unlawful imprisonment. 120,000 men, women, and children held at 6 political prison camps, subjected to an endless, vicious cycle of induced malnutrition and forced labor. In February 2014, a UN Commission of Inquiry submitted its report on the human rights situation in the DPRK to the UN. In that report, the UNCOI, after a year-long investigation, found that many of the egregious human rights violations perpetrated by the Kim regime against its own people amount to crimes against humanity committed pursuant to policies established at the highest level of the state. Further, the UNCOI recommended strong accountability measures. Of course, today in the United States, the ICC is politically a controversial issue, but the UNCOI recommended referral by the UN Security Council to the International Criminal Court. Every year we have had strong UN Human Rights Council resolutions, strong General Assembly resolution. There's a General Assembly resolution pending in the third committee of the General Assembly right now. Every year since 2014, North Korean human rights has been placed on the agenda of the UN Security Council. I am a student of diplomacy myself. I will never speak against diplomacy. The Trump administration has experimented with a tool never tried before in the toolkit available to the diplomat, summit diplomacy. We have witnessed a flurry of Sino-DPRK, inter-Korean, US DPRK diplomacy, including summit diplomacy. Again, diplomacy is a great thing. That said, the actual situation on the ground, the situation of the people of North Korea has not changed, has not improved. This is a unique case where the entire population of the country is categorized into three categories: loyal class, 20 to 25%, wavering class, hostile class, 20 to 25% of the population, depending on the perceived loyalty of that respective individual and family members. Human rights organizations are under pressure. This is no surprise. We have seen human rights in the DPRK often being sacrificed on the altar of political security and military issues. This has happened before. We are facing pressure in South Korea, where the government is very keen on inter-Korean reconciliation and is sacrificing human rights defenders and resources, funds for North Korean human rights groups in the process. So it's not an easy situation. On the 24th of October, we had a side event at the UN. We were under tremendous pressure. Our event was initially canceled by UN officials. We brought it back from the dead, turned it around 180 degrees. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I'm very happy to be amongst friends tonight. Thank you very much for giving us a voice, for organizing this event, and quite frankly, for spending your Friday evening away from families listening to us, human rights defenders, addressing some very difficult issues in some very difficult areas in the world. Finally, because I do have to engage in a shameless act of self-promotion, our organization produces a lot of reports and books. They're all available on hrnk.org. hrnk.org. Please do visit our website, friend us on social media. We most definitely look forward to staying in touch. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Greg. Very much appreciated. I wanted to add that the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea is the only think tank that works in the United States on Korean issues and research and human rights in North Korea. So it's extremely important. And up next we have Miss Nicole Margaret, excuse me. And Miss Margaret represents the Uyghur Human Rights Project. The Uyghur Human Rights Project, also called UHRP, was founded by the Uyghur American Association, UAA, in 2004 with support from the National Endowment for Democracy, NED. UHRP's mission is to promote human rights and democracy for the Uyghur people and to raise awareness of human rights abuses that occur in East Turkestan, referred to by the Chinese authorities since 1955 as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, XUAR. In 2016, the Uyghur Human Rights Project became an independent 501(c) nonprofit. It is a human rights research research, reporting, and advocacy organization. And as someone who spent some time myself in the Uyghur in Xinjiang province and traveled extensively around that region, I'm very keen to hear Ms. Margaret's presentation. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me here tonight to introduce UHRP and our mission and to give you a little bit of background on the current human rights crisis that is ongoing in the region. As the introduction stated, we were founded in 2004 under the umbrella of the Uyghur American Association, which is a community organization for the Uyghur diaspora here in the DC area and across the United States. But in 2016, UHRP became an independent advocacy organization to focus on our main mission. When we were first founded in 2004, there was very little information available on the Uyghur issue. In fact, most people had never heard of the Uyghurs or were aware of their situation. So we were founded in order to try to resolve that issue, the first step being awareness of what is going on. The issue, however, has truly burst into the public consciousness in the past year or so due to the fact that it has become, there has been an unprecedented escalation in the level of repression that is going on. Currently, an estimated 10% of the Uyghur population, so over 1 million people, are currently being held in re-education camps or internment camps, a situation which began about 1 year ago during the middle of 2017. We first truly became aware of the issue when Uyghur students who were studying abroad were beginning to disappear, being forced to return to their homes in East Turkestan for political assessment, and many of them were simply disappearing or were not able to again leave the country. It became clear that a huge percentage of the population was being placed in these so-called re-education camps in order to politically indoctrinate them in the Communist Party doctrine, as well as simply, it appears, holding them indefinitely extrajudicially. The people in these camps, many of them are simply people who have had any contact with Uyghurs who have lived abroad, people who have been abroad and traveled for any length of time. Many of them are scholars, academics, wealthy businessmen, even pop stars, singers, that sort of thing. So the Chinese government is currently asserting that the people who are in the camps are undergoing vocational training. And when it became obvious that they could not hide what was currently going on, they began to try to frame it as a situation of sort of charity to try to give job skills to Uyghurs. But because many of the people who are in the camps are professionals, members of the Uyghur elite, as well as many elderly people, it's obvious that this is in fact intended to hasten a forcible assimilation of the Uyghur people by decapitating their elite and attempting to exert an enormous amount of control over the general population. This week was the Universal Periodic Review of China's human rights record, and there were numerous strong statements from governments, including the United States, to calling on China to release the people who are being held extrajudicially in East Turkestan, and specifically calling for attention to be paid to ethnic minority rights inside China, including towards the Uyghurs and Tibetans and others. But other nations declined to raise the issue. This is due to the fact that China is an extremely wealthy and influential country, and that is the reason why one of the main goals of the Uyghur Human Rights Project is to address and engage the broader Chinese-speaking community. While there have been an increasing number of resources of information for people who speak English through the international media, there's still somewhat of a lack in the Chinese language. So we have a dedicated Chinese outreach program, both to engage the Chinese democracy movement, as well as allies like the Tibetans, and then just the general Chinese-speaking population, because we do know that if the problem is to be solved and resolved, and human rights are to be respected, not just in East Turkestan, but in China for all Chinese citizens. It will have to begin with the Chinese themselves. So I would be happy to answer any questions later. I realize that many people do not have a strong background understanding of the issue. The Uyghurs are a Turkic minority from the far west, the province which the Chinese government calls the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, but the Uyghurs often refer to by the traditional name of East Turkestan. And they are, because they're a Turkic people, they speak a language completely different from Chinese. Their traditional culture is completely different from the Chinese, and in many ways their situation parallels that of the Tibetans. While there are other Muslim minorities in China, they do not face the same level of repression that the Uyghurs are currently facing. In fact, there's been a general downturn in the human rights situation since Xi Jinping took office. So we're seeing crackdowns on human rights broadly, including many attacks on religious freedom, including of Christians and so forth, but these have not reached the level of what is taking place in East Turkestan. And we fear that what is happening in East Turkestan will not necessarily be confined there. There's a certain level of technological repression, which we believe might be being developed in kind of a laboratory setting there to be exported across China and perhaps eventually the world. So we really do believe that the Uyghur situation is not an obscure marginal situation, but is really at the cutting edge of the repression of human rights. And it's something that everyone needs to really deeply consider and pay attention to. We are somewhat hopeful that the attention currently being paid to it will translate into some concrete policy goals. There is currently a lot of attention being paid to it on Capitol Hill, including our chairman of the board addressing the subcommittee on East Asia for the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So the United States government is recognizing this not only as a dire human rights situation, but a issue that's going to probably increasingly come forth in U.S.-China relations, as well as China's relations with other nations around the world. So we genuinely believe that it's not in China's interest to be pursuing the policy that they're currently pursuing. So we're hoping that people such as yourselves who are engaged in international affairs will research more about the issue. What research is one of our main goals, and so we're hoping that if you're interested in more, we also produce many reports, which you can find on uhrp.org. And I think I'll leave it there and not take up too much of the other speakers' time. But I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Margaret. And up next, we have Mr. Mansour Al-Hajj. Mansour Al-Hajj is a native of Saudi Arabia, and he is on the board of directors of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, which almost sounds like a contradiction of terms. It is a U.S.-based nonprofit, and it was established to promote democratic and human rights through peaceful transformation of Saudi political, religious, educational, and social institutions. Getting to that point where I need no glasses. The agency, or the think tank rather, it is a US-based nonprofit, and it highlights the threats it believes to be posed by the Saudi Wahhabist ideology. Mr. Al-Hajj has presented in multiple briefings on Capitol Hill, including on the topic of movement of extremism in the Muslim world, struggle between states and citizens. Obviously, he is at a very cogent place doing exceedingly cogent research at this particular moment in the current events. And we very much look forward to, and he's become a bit of a media celebrity in the last couple of weeks because of the negative news coming out of Saudi Arabia. So he is one of the few representatives of a human rights group that deals with Saudi Arabia and from Saudi Arabia. So with keen interest and enthusiasm, we welcome Mr. Al-Hajj.
Hello everyone. I would like to thank Conflict Solution International for giving me this opportunity, and for the Church of Scientology as well, and thank you for coming. It's a rainy Friday night, as he said, and thank you for being here listening to us. Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, CDHR, was founded in 2004 to basically promote institutionalized democratic and human rights reform in Saudi Arabia as the best way of achieving long-term stability in Saudi Arabia, which is, we all know, a key U.S. Strategic ally and a major player in the turbulent and volatile Gulf region, which supplies a large portion of energy sources important to the economies of trading partner and allies of the United States. One of the elements that we actually promote in CDHR is the need of reforming the intolerant and radical militant form of Islam associated with the Saudi Wahhabi doctrine, which continue to be spreading and have an adverse impact on traditional Muslim communities worldwide. I can talk in length about the Saudi export of Wahhabism in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Asia, all around the world. The terrorist group that we see everywhere basically can be traced back somewhere or another to Saudi Arabia or to the Wahhabi doctrine that Saudi Arabia is promoting. CDHR basically exists to assist the citizens of Saudi Arabia in realizing their economic and social potential through objective analysis of events and issues and other form of public education. CDHR is a political non-sectarian and does not engage in lobbying activities. We basically also gather information from a wide range of sources about current events in Saudi Arabia and analyze and interpret their impact on Saudi society, the greater Middle East, and international community. These unique findings are disseminated to policymakers and public media, educational institutions, and a variety of non-governmental organizations. The distribution of CDHR information is widely dispersed via our newsletter, website, blog, Twitter, and Facebook. In addition, CDHR staff organize educational conferences, congressional briefings, and participate in multitude of public and official events. CDHR also promote freedom of worship. We actually believe that religious freedom is the most fundamental rights that when it exists, other rights can also take part in a community. In Saudi Arabia, people don't have freedom, religious freedom. So promoting religious freedom is one of our main objectives at CDHR. We also promote political reform, meaning transforming of Saudi political structure from current autocratic one-family rule to a representative political structure, including a constitutional monarchy where all citizens and expatriates liberties and expatriates liberties and full right are protected under the rule of non-sectarian laws, and where citizens are constitutionally empowered to participate in the state decision-making process. Another thing that we promote at CDHR is freedom of the press, women's rights, which is a huge issue. Basically, whenever Saudi Arabia is mentioned, before the Khashoggi case was basically women's rights and the fact that women were not allowed to drive cars. And we have been promoting women's rights for a long time. And basically right now we believe that the current reform that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is doing, we believe it's just for international propaganda to promote himself as a reformer. But in fact, the situation of human rights violations in Saudi Arabia has increased under Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. We also promote economic reform and non-sectarian judicial system. As I have said earlier, that Saudi Arabia is a Wahhabi country, and oftentimes people don't hear about the Shia citizens of Saudi Arabia who unfortunately go to Wahhabi school and are forced to study Wahhabism rather than their own sect. In our activities, we basically provide thought-provoking and accurate information and analysis. A lot of people in Saudi Arabia can't communicate with us directly because they would face they will be singled out, and they can face jail time for communicating with us. Freedom of the press is totally prohibited in Saudi Arabia. All the newspapers and TV stations in Saudi Arabia are controlled by the government. We also, part of what we do is we monitor and conduct research on human rights, women and minorities. I've already talked about that. we do network like this type of events with other groups, think tank and congressional staffer in Washington to provide them with current information about Saudi Arabia. We also provide presentations at conferences and events like this. Our last conference was last month, early last month, and it was in Washington D.C., right, very close, and it was about Saudi Arabia after King Salman. So we believe the country, the current state of the country is unstable, and it really requires a lot of attention from lawmakers. And I would like to conclude by saying, for our strategic interests with Saudi Arabia and for our national security, if the Saudi people are liberated, it would be better off than continuing supporting this autocratic regime that basically bar people from their basic human rights. Thank you for listening to me, and I welcome any question you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very enlightening. That was very enlightening from all four of our panelists. And I would like to open the floor for questions. But I've actually got a couple of questions, having been in the Central Asia and the Middle East for most of the last 10 years. I was I was intrigued by all of the presentations, but by some of the things that you shared, Mansour, about your organization. I'm wondering if you mentioned that you work also on the level of political transformation as an objective of your organization. And I'm wondering, as someone, as here in America, that we have a relationship with the regime as it exists, and then you have this closed system, of Saudi and the Saudi people and their inability to get news. How is it that you work on the level of transforming political regime when that's not an objective of the U.S. at this moment? So I'm curious if you might have some comments about that.
In the briefings,
Just one moment, let's wait for the mic. Thank you.
in the briefings and in the conferences that we do, we try to highlight that our best interest would be by pushing for policies that agrees with our constitutions, the basic fundamentals that this country is based on. So we often get really disappointed because on one hand, now, for example, the U.S. is putting sanctions on Iran because of Iran's activities in the region, and also because of what the regime is, doing in Iran. But at the same time, we are selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, and even we didn't even condemn the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, and we still can't decide if we should place sanctions on Saudi Arabia or those involved. So the double standard, basically, it's hurting our image internationally, and this is one way we promote that. Another way is by also encouraging people inside Saudi Arabia to stand up for their rights and hopefully manage to change the regime themselves, because one thing we care about is stability too. And right now, Saudi Arabia is not stable because of its system. Saudi Arabia is stable because of the level of oppression that is emplacing on its people. And this is not a long-term stability in the region. It doesn't really sustain in the long term.
So that's very elucidating. So on the first level, it's putting pressure on the U.S. to change its bilateral political posture towards Saudi Arabia, as I understand. So that's pretty clear. But the second, and I appreciated your answer on that. The second part that you mentioned, though, the work to actually influence Saudi citizens, how, in a place where there isn't WhatsApp and where media is so tightly controlled, how on earth do you do that?
Well, through social media, Saudis are one of the most users of social media in the world, Facebook and Twitter. And even though it's controlled somehow in Saudi Arabia and the government can basically imprison people just based on their tweets, or even if they don't tweet in support of the government. So if you, for example, if somebody is silent, it's would be considered a crime if you don't fully support the government. So through that, now a lot of Saudi activists are using the platform, even without using the real names, to push for reform. And also, I think a lot of people here know that there are thousands of Saudi students worldwide. Here in the United States, there are more than 100,000 students. And I think they will learn something wherever they go, and they will appreciate living in free societies to push for that in their countries. And the day will come when they realize that they have to have a stake in the decision-making process in their country.
Thank you. That was very elucidating. Appreciate that. And Nicole, I have a question for you, having spent some time in that part of the world. You mentioned, when I was trying to interview Uyghurs, as I mentioned to you, just about their feelings about being a minority or just their life, just a social question. And this was in year 2004. No one really wanted to speak with any degree offer anything personal. And when they did, they would agree to meet myself and my travel partner, who was my brother, in a field, in a very, very remote place, very far from any surveillance, and then they wouldn't show up. And since that time, it's gotten so much worse. And you mentioned that you mentioned something in terms of the how you know that about the internment camps and the re-education camps, and maybe you could speak to us just for a few moments about the technology surveillance, how we know this is occurring, because it's only recently made the press.
Yes. Well, as I said, we first began to really notice that people were disappearing on a mass scale when it became obvious that people were being forced to return to their hometowns and were not being able to leave again. And there were increasing amounts of reports of trickling out from individual towns and cities of saying, 10,000 people have been imprisoned here, 15,000 there. And adding up all of these different reports, it became obvious that it could be over 1 million people who were being extrajudicially detained. And at this time, there were scholars and people researching this issue could find online public bids for building these camps, which would actually have very detailed information about who they were hiring to staff them, the kinds of equipment that were going into them, which have included things like, shock batons and tiger chairs, as well as all the kind of equipment for SWAT team police. And for the addresses of these places, so they would look up where these places supposedly were, and we're seeing satellite footage of these camps growing. And some of them are, a kilometer large and are just of enormous scale, truly enormous scale. And there are reports of great overcrowding in them, so you can also get a impression of the size of these facilities. And recently, as the Chinese government began to see that it could not really hide what was going on that well, they begin to claim that it's vocational training, but in fact the budget, which is of the province, which is also public, shows that the money that is going to vocational training has actually declined over the past year, whereas the money going to the Ministry of Justice, which is not like our Justice Department, it's it oversees the prisons and the former re-education through labor system, their budget skyrocketed. So they're obviously the people who are administrating these camps, not the vocational training, which has gone down probably because there aren't that many people to train anymore if they're all in camps. So there's a plethora of that kind of official government documents, including pictures from inside camps that have later been removed from the internet after all this blowback that China has been getting. But also there have been a trickle of eyewitness reports, including from, for example, naturalized citizens of Kazakhstan who are ethnic Kazakh, who were the Kazakh people who are also a Turkic people related to the Uyghurs. They've also been sent to these camps, and some of them who've become citizens of Kazakhstan have been able to leave. So there are some of the few eyewitness reports of people who have been in the camps and been able to get out that we have, because otherwise it seems like very few people are being released, even to go back into the population inside East Turkestan. So,
Thank you. All right, that was very interesting. And you're probably one of the foremost experts on that subject, which is quite, it's just now, as you say, becoming a more and more of an emerging media issue. Greg, I have a question for you. You did mention that that the U.S. is employing a new tool under the Trump administration for dealing with North Korea in terms of meeting, as our president did earlier this year. I'm wondering to the extent to which you personally, as a North Korean expert, feel that is, the stakes are still not out yet, but where do you feel in terms of the effectiveness of that, and what more could we be doing from the U.S. side of the house?
Well, we certainly have movement. Now the trick is to channel that movement. Of course, the big issue here is denuclearization. To us, the USA, to the UN and the international community, denuclearization of North Korea means the complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization of North Korea. To the Kim regime, they refer to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. There haven't been nuclear weapons in South Korea since 1991. When they refer to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, what they mean is the removal of South Korea from the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, the termination of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea.
So we both have two different definitions.
Of course, in school we learn about the zone of possible agreement, about ZOPA and BATNA, best alternative to a negotiated deal. The North Koreans did not go to the school of ZOPA or the school of BATNA. The North Koreans went to the school of zero-sum games. Your loss is my gain. That's how they have operated for decades now. Have things changed? Of course, in this line of work, we all have to be hopeful and hope for the best. Again, we encourage diplomacy, but especially in taking into consideration what's happening right now in interaction with North Korea, I don't think we have too many reasons to be very optimistic. But then again, things can always take a turn for the better. We see this inter-Korean reconciliation process, but of course the price of inter-Korean reconciliation. Actually, the ultimate measure of reconciliation and peace on the Korean Peninsula is the impact it has on the Korean people living in the South and the North. If the price of unification is sacrificing prosperous, democratic Republic of Korea, South Korea, that is a price too high to pay. So we have to approach this process with extreme caution, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you. And Isabel, bravo to you on your work educating people on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I was also involved in working on that level with the UN. And it's interesting because, of course, we know that there's two levels. There's the citizenry level and holding citizens empowering citizens with their knowledge of the rights, and then holding governments to account so that governments protect their rights. Often, as you aptly pointed out, most countries do not align their legislation. They sign their signatories to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but they actually don't align their legislation. So they're just signing something that's very vacant. And I'm wondering, to the extent to which your education and training, do you follow that to see to whether that you are, does that have an advocacy role? Are you actually empowering people not just to know their rights, but to actually move forward and try to hold their governments accountable to to protect those rights, and or to sign to align or to create the necessary legislation so that those rights are enshrined in their own country's laws?
A short answer to that question, yes. Now I'm gonna give you the explanation in how we do that, and you got a short chance to see in the videos. So what United for Human Rights program does is not only inspiring others to advocate for tolerance and peace, because that's the whole goal of the Youth for Human Rights International and the United for Human Rights. Is not only me who I need to know my rights, I need to inspire others and educate others also to know their rights. So what we do petition drives, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's, as the name says, a declaration. So there's an impossibility of adoption. It's not something that you can ratify and put it into law in your country as it is. However, that's why, and Greg mentioned in his speech, that's why we have the international covenants, which unfortunately the United States is not part of the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, which that was the part where you actually implement the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Then the United States, it's not part of the International Convention on Against Discrimination for Women. The United States, it's not part of the International Covenant on the Children's Rights. So here is where we have a problem, and that's how we do. And in order to have all these documents adopted and become a law in a country, you need to educate the population. Because exactly as I mentioned in my speech, how can you stand up for your rights if you don't know what your rights are? And that's how all, like, revolutions, that's how you make a revolution. Having people stand up for their rights and demand something. So in order to be a demand, you have to educate the population. And it's my belief that it's not wanted to educate. Eleanor Roosevelt, as Greg mentioned, we are celebrating this year on the 10th of December, the 70th anniversary since the Universal Declaration has been adopted. Well, the dream of Eleanor Roosevelt when she helped on drafting this declaration was, and she mentioned that in the General Assembly of the United Nations, the dream is to have every child on earth and in every school to be taught this important document. Well, guess what? That did not happen, and unfortunately, here we stand 70 years after that, and this is what United for Human Rights does. It wants to take the lead, and actually, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? Who's going to teach all this next generation? Because we are trying to get rid of these leaders who are totalitarian, who are communists, who don't promote human rights. And the way to do that is teaching the next generations who will come after that, and will have other thoughts about that.
Thank you. Thank you. Very well put. And all four panelists, it was just wonderful to hear all of your points of view, and your passion came through, and you gave us a lot of really, really good tools. I think one of our panelists is going to have to leave. I don't know if we have time to open it up for questions, or George, how would you like to? Okay, so we will be taking questions during the reception. Everyone is invited to come. And I want to give our panelists a huge hand. Thank you so very much. And thank you for CSI, and thank you for the Church of Scientology for hosting us.